Picture this. A wealthy rancher in 1880s Montana orders himself a proper wife through the mail, expecting a sweet, innocent church girl to arrive on the morning train. Instead, the woman who steps off that dusty platform is Ruby Mae Henderson, the most scandalous saloon girl this side of the Mississippi, complete with painted lips, a corset that could stop traffic, and a reputation that precedes her by 3 counties. What happens next will shake the foundations of Clearwater Valley forever, because sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes the wrong woman turns out to be exactly the right one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Clearwater Valley as Garrett Mitchell stood on his wraparound porch, watching the distant mountains painted gold by dawn's first light. At 32, he owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, commanded respect from every man in town, and had built an empire from nothing but grit, determination, and a keen eye for business. Yet for all his success, his sprawling ranch house echoed with loneliness. The idea had come to him during another sleepless night 3 months prior. He'd been reading the Helena Daily Herald when an advertisement caught his eye. Matrimonial Correspondence Bureau. Respectable Christian ladies seeking good husbands. After weeks of deliberation and whiskey-fueled courage, Garrett had penned his first letter to Miss Catherine Eleanor Worthington of Philadelphia, describing himself as a successful rancher seeking a virtuous wife to share his life and build a family. Miss Worthington's responses had been everything he'd hoped for: eloquent, modest, and filled with references to church activities and charitable works. She wrote of her love for reading scripture, her skill with needlework, and her desire to be a proper wife and mother. Through their correspondence, Garrett had painted a picture of domestic bliss that seemed almost too good to be true. The town of Clearwater Bend had buzzed with excitement when word spread that the territory's most eligible bachelor was finally taking a bride. Mrs. Dorothy Henshaw, the banker's wife and unofficial town gossip, had spent weeks organizing a welcome committee. Reverend Samuel Clark had prepared special marriage counseling sessions, and even old Doc Harrison had offered his services should the new bride need any medical attention after her long journey west. Garrett had spared no expense preparing for his bride's arrival. He'd hired Maria Santos, a widow from the Mexican settlement south of town, to serve as housekeeper and cook. The master bedroom had been redecorated with delicate floral wallpaper ordered from San Francisco, and he'd commissioned a set of fine china from Denver for their wedding feast. Every detail had been carefully planned to welcome the refined lady he'd been corresponding with. The previous evening, Garrett had received a telegram from the depot master in Helena. "Your party arrives tomorrow morning by train. Stop. Prepare accordingly. Stop." He'd barely slept, alternating between excitement and nervousness about finally meeting the woman who would become his wife. As he dressed that morning, Garrett had chosen his finest clothes. A charcoal wool suit his tailor in Helena had assured him was the height of Eastern fashion, polished leather boots, and his father's gold pocket watch. He wanted to make the best possible impression on Miss Worthington, to show her that despite living on the frontier, he was a civilized and successful man. The ride into town seemed longer than usual, though it was the same 5 miles he'd traveled countless times before. Clearwater Bend wasn't much to look at. A main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, saloon, church, and bank, surrounded by a handful of houses and businesses that served the ranching community. But it was home, and he hoped Miss Worthington would come to love it as much as he did. The train station was little more than a wooden platform with a small building that served as both ticket office and freight depot. By the time Garrett arrived, a small crowd had already gathered. Mrs. Henshaw stood with her welcoming committee of church ladies, each clutching small bouquets of wildflowers. Mayor Benjamin Fletcher had donned his finest suit and practiced his welcoming speech 3 times that morning. Even Sheriff Jake Morrison had polished his badge for the occasion. The distant whistle of the approaching train sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered crowd. Garrett felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the great iron beast rounded the bend, black smoke billowing from its stack. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the locomotive pulled into the station with a tremendous hiss of steam and screech of brakes. As passengers began disembarking, Garrett scanned each face, looking for the modest young lady he'd been expecting. An elderly couple descended first, followed by a traveling salesman clutching his sample case, then a family with 3 small children. But there was no sign of the refined Miss Catherine Eleanor Worthington. Then she appeared. The woman who stepped down from the passenger car bore no resemblance whatsoever to the demure bride Garrett had been expecting. She was tall and curvaceous, with flame-red hair piled high beneath a feathered hat that probably cost more than most folks in Clearwater Bend made in a month. Her emerald-green dress was cut low enough to make the church ladies gasp, and fitted tight enough to leave nothing to the imagination. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, and her lips were painted scarlet as fresh blood. But it was her eyes that truly set her apart, jade green and sharp as cut glass, missing nothing as they swept over the assembled crowd with an amused expression that suggested she found the whole situation rather entertaining. The woman carried herself with the confidence of someone who owned every room she entered. Her movements were fluid and deliberate as she surveyed the welcoming committee, and when her gaze finally settled on Garrett, one perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched with unmistakable interest. Mrs. Henshaw's bouquet of wildflowers fell forgotten to the platform as her mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The other church ladies huddled together, whispering furiously behind gloved hands. Mayor Fletcher's prepared speech died in his throat, and Sheriff Morrison's hand unconsciously moved to rest on his gun belt. The woman approached Garrett directly, her heels clicking against the wooden platform with each confident step. When she stopped in front of him, he caught the scent of expensive perfume mixed with whiskey and tobacco smoke, a combination that should have repelled him, but instead sent an unexpected thrill down his spine. "You must be Garrett Mitchell," she said, her voice husky and warm like aged bourbon. "I'm Ruby Mae Henderson, though I suspect you were expecting someone else entirely." The name hit Garrett like a physical blow. Ruby Mae Henderson wasn't just any woman. She was legendary throughout the Montana Territory. Stories of her exploits had spread from mining camps to cattle towns. Tales of a woman who ran the most successful and scandalous establishment in Silver Creek, 200 miles south. She was said to be as dangerous as she was beautiful, as clever as she was ruthless, and absolutely the last person who should be standing on the platform of Clearwater Bend, claiming to be his mail-order bride. "There's been some mistake," Garrett managed to say, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Ruby Mae's smile was slow and predatory. "Oh, honey, there's been a mistake, all right. But it wasn't mine." She pulled a folded letter from her reticule and held it out to him. "I've got a contract here that says otherwise. Signed, sealed, and legally binding. Say you're looking for a wife, and I'm looking for a husband. Seems like fate to me." Garrett stared at the letter in her outstretched hand as if it were a rattlesnake. Behind him, he could hear the frantic whispers of the townspeople, the sound growing louder as words spread through the crowd. Mrs. Henshaw looked ready to faint, and Reverend Clark appeared to be praying silently, his lips moving rapidly as he clutched his prayer book. "This can't be right," Garrett said, finally taking the letter with trembling fingers. "I've been corresponding with Miss Catherine Worthington of Philadelphia, a respectable young lady from a good Christian family." Ruby Mae's laugh was rich and throaty, causing several men in the crowd to crane their necks for a better look. "Oh, sweet Catherine. Lovely girl, really. Terrible shame about her running off with that piano player from the music hall. Left quite suddenly, I'm told. But don't you worry, sugar. She spoke very highly of you in her letters, and when she asked me to fulfill her obligation, well, how could I refuse?" The world seemed to tilt sideways as Garrett processed her words. Catherine Worthington, his pious, virtuous bride-to-be, had apparently abandoned their arrangement to elope with a musician, leaving in her place the most notorious woman in the territory. "You can't be serious," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he could see the truth in Ruby May's confident expression. "Dead serious, darling. I've got the contract, I've got the train ticket with your name on it, and I've traveled 4 days to get here. According to the law, that makes me your intended bride." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "Unless, of course, you're the kind of man who goes back on his word." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and Garrett felt the eyes of the entire town upon him. In a place where a man's word was his bond, and reputation meant everything, backing down now would mark him as untrustworthy and weak. Yet marrying Ruby May Henderson would be social suicide, aligning himself with a woman whose very presence scandalized decent folk. "I need time to think," he said finally. Ruby May's smile widened. "Of course you do, sugar. This is all quite sudden. But while you're thinking, you might want to consider that I've already paid for my return ticket to Silver Creek. The train leaves the day after tomorrow. After that, well, let's just say you'll have missed your chance at wedded bliss." She turned to address the still gaping crowd, her voice carrying easily across the platform. "Good morning, fine people of Clearwater Bend. I'm Ruby May Henderson, and I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. I do hope we'll all become the very best of friends. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Henshaw actually swooned, requiring 2 other ladies to catch her before she hit the platform. Mayor Fletcher began backing toward his office, muttering about urgent municipal business. Even Sheriff Morrison looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Only Dr. Harrison seemed unaffected by the chaos. The elderly physician stepped forward, tipping his hat politely to Ruby May. "Welcome to Clearwater Bend, Miss Henderson. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Why, thank you, Doctor. How refreshing to meet a true gentleman." Ruby May's smile was genuine this time, and Garrett noticed how it transformed her entire face, softening the sharp edges and revealing something almost vulnerable beneath the bold exterior. "Perhaps," Dr. Harrison continued, "you'd allow me to escort you to the hotel while Mr. Mitchell considers his options. I'm sure you'd like to freshen up after your travels." Ruby May accepted his offered arm with grace. How thoughtful of you. "I could certainly use a bath and a decent meal." She glanced back at Garrett, her expression unreadable. "Take all the time you need, honey. I'll be right here when you've made up your mind." As Dr. Harrison escorted her toward the Clearwater Hotel, Garrett watched them go, his mind reeling with the impossibility of his situation. Behind him, the crowd was dispersing rapidly, eager to spread the news of his predicament throughout the valley. By nightfall, every ranch and homestead for 50 miles would know that Garrett Mitchell's mail-order bride had turned out to be Ruby May Henderson herself. He climbed back into his wagon mechanically, his thoughts churning like storm clouds. The ride home passed in a blur of dust and regret, punctuated by the mocking laughter of crows that seemed to appreciate the cosmic joke that had just been played on him. Back at the ranch, Maria Santos took one look at his face and immediately began preparing strong coffee. She'd worked for him long enough to recognize when her employer was facing a crisis, and she possessed the wisdom to know that some problems required both caffeine and careful consideration. As Garrett sat on his porch that afternoon, staring out at the vast expanse of his domain, he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Everything he'd planned, everything he'd hoped for, had been turned upside down in the span of a single morning. The refined, virtuous wife he'd dreamed of had been replaced by a woman whose reputation alone could destroy everything he'd built, yet as much as he tried to focus on the scandal and the problems Ruby May's presence would cause, he couldn't shake the memory of her jade-green eyes or the way she'd faced down the entire town without flinching. There had been something magnificent about her confidence, Something almost admirable about the way she'd refused to be intimidated by their shocked disapproval. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Maria finally spoke. "Senor Garrett, perhaps this is not the disaster you think it is." He looked at her in surprise. "Maria, do you understand who that woman is? What she represent?" The older woman's smile was knowing. "I understand that she is a woman far from home, taking a great risk for reasons we do not yet know. And I understand that you, senor, have been alone too long to judge anyone's past too harshly." As darkness fell over the Clearwater Valley, Garrett knew that come morning he would have to make the most important decision of his life. He could honor the contract and marry Ruby Mae Henderson, accepting whatever consequences followed. Or he could find a way to break the agreement and send her back to Silver Creek, preserving his reputation but remaining forever alone. What he couldn't know was that 200 miles away, in the smoky back room of a Silver Creek saloon, 3 very dangerous men were studying a map of Montana territory, their fingers tracing the route to a small town called Clearwater Bend. Ruby Mae Henderson had left Silver Creek rather suddenly, taking with her something that didn't belong to her, and her former associates were not the forgiving type. The game was just beginning, and none of the players yet understood the stakes they were truly playing for. The oil lamp flickered in Garrett's study as he pored over the legal documents spread across his mahogany desk. The marriage contract Ruby Mae had presented was ironclad, witnessed, notarized, and bearing the official seal of the Matrimonial Correspondence Bureau. His lawyer's signature appeared at the bottom, alongside Catherine Worthington's delicate script, assigning all rights and obligations to one Ruby Mae Henderson of Silver Creek. A sharp knock interrupted his brooding. Without waiting for permission, Ruby Mae swept into the room like she owned the place. She changed from her traveling dress into something even more shocking, a burgundy silk wrapper that clung to her curves and left little to the imagination. Her red hair cascaded over her shoulders in waves that caught the lamplight like spun copper. "Evening, husband-to-be," she said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk without invitation. "Hope you don't mind me making myself at home. Your housekeeper is quite the treasure, by the way. Made me the finest beef stew I've had in months." Garrett forced himself to meet her gaze, though the sight of her in his private sanctuary made his pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with anger. "We need to discuss terms." "Terms?" Ruby Mae's eyebrows rose with amusement. "Sugar, I'm not a business transaction. Though I suppose in a way, marriage always is." She leaned back in the chair, studying him with those penetrating green eyes. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "If we go through with this arrangement, there will be conditions," Garrett said, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is a respectable community. There are certain expectations." Ruby Mae's laugh was like warm honey poured over broken glass. "Let me guess. No drinking, no smoking, no cursing, and definitely no mention of my colorful past. Transform myself into the perfect little rancher's wife who bakes pies and tends the garden. Something like that, yes." She stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit valley. In profile, with the harsh lines of her face softened by shadow, she looked almost ethereal. "You know, Garrett, can I call you Garrett? Most men who visit my establishment want exactly the opposite. They pay good money for me to be as improper as possible." The casual mention of her profession sent heat flooding through him, though whether from embarrassment or something else entirely, he couldn't say. "That's precisely the problem. This town already thinks you're here to corrupt their moral fiber." Ruby Mae turned from the window, her expression suddenly serious. "And what do you think?" The question hung between them like smoke from a fired pistol. Garrett found himself studying her face, searching for some clue to the woman beneath the notorious reputation. What he saw surprised him. Intelligence, certainly, but also something that might have been vulnerability quickly masked. "I think you're running from something," he said finally. "And I think you need this marriage more than you're letting on." For a moment her composure cracked, revealing something raw and desperate beneath. Then the mask slipped back into place and she was Ruby Mae Henderson again, confident, untouchable, dangerous. "Smart man," she said softly. "That's going to make this interesting." A commotion outside interrupted them, the sound of horses approaching fast, their hooves pounding against the packed earth of the yard. Garrett moved to the window and peered through the darkness, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle mounted above his desk. "Expecting company?" Ruby Mae asked, though her casual tone didn't match the tension that had suddenly filled her body. "No." Garrett lifted the rifle and checked the chamber. "Stay back from the windows." The riders came to a halt just beyond the circle of light cast by the porch lanterns. Garrett counted at least 6 men, their faces hidden beneath hat brims and shadow. One of them dismounted and approached the house with the confident swagger of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Mitchell," the voice carried easily across the yard. "We need to have ourselves a conversation." Ruby Mae had gone completely still, her face pale as moonlight. "That's Buck Torrance," she whispered. "And if he's here, that means—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Garrett could see fear flickering in her eyes like candlelight. "Friend of yours?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Former business partner. The kind who doesn't take kindly to sudden departures." She moved away from the window, her earlier confidence evaporating. "Garrett, I need you to understand something. When I left Silver Creek, I took something that didn't belong to me." "What kind of something?" Before she could answer, Buck Torrance's voice boomed across the yard again. "Send out the lady, Mitchell. This ain't your fight." Garrett felt the familiar calm that always descended on him in moments of danger. He'd fought Apaches, claimed jumpers and cattle rustlers in his time, and he'd learned that fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. It became my fight the moment she stepped off that train. Ruby Mae stared at him in surprise. "You don't understand what you're getting into. Buck's not just some angry ex-lover. He's connected to people who make their living from other people's misery. Cross him, and you'll have more trouble than you know what to do with. Then you'd better start explaining. Because I'm not handing you over to anyone without knowing why they want you." She was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she reached into her reticule and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins. $20,000, she said simply, skimmed from the house receipts over 2 years. "Buck thought I was just another dumb whore who couldn't count past 10. Garrett whistled low. $20,000 was more money than most men saw in a lifetime. That's quite a nest egg. It was my ticket out, my chance at something better than what I was. Her voice was fierce now, all pretense dropped. "I earned every penny of that money, Garrett. Maybe not in ways your church ladies would approve of, but I earned it just the same. Mitchell." Buck's patience was clearly wearing thin. "I'm going to count to 10, and then we're coming in after her." Garrett moved to the front door and stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. In the pale moonlight, he could make out 6 mounted figures, all armed and looking like the kind of men who settled disputes with lead rather than words. Buck Torrance sat on his horse like a king surveying his domain. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders and thick around the middle, with the pale, soft look of someone who spent his time indoors counting money while other people did the dangerous work. His clothes were expensive but flashy, the kind of outfit that screamed new money and poor taste. "Evening, Torrance," Garrett said calmly. "Kind of late for social cause, don't you think?" "This ain't social, Mitchell. The lady took something that belongs to me, and I want it back. Send her out and we can settle this peaceful-like." "I'm afraid I can't do that. Miss Henderson is under my protection now." Buck's laugh was ugly. "Protection? Boy, you don't know what you're dealing with. That woman's a thief and a whore, and she's got something that ain't hers to keep." The words hit Garrett like physical blows, but not because they wounded his pride. What surprised him was the surge of protective anger that rose in his chest at hearing Ruby Mae spoken of so casually. "I'd watch my language if I were you, Torrance. You're on my land now, and I don't take kindly to men who insult women under my roof." One of Buck's men snickered. "Under your roof? Hell, Mitchell, half the territory's been under her roof, if you catch my meaning." The rifle was in Garrett's hands and aimed before the man finished speaking. Does anyone else want to share their thoughts on the subject? The sudden silence was broken only by the nervous pawing of horses and the distant call of a night bird. Buck raised his hand, signaling his men to stay calm, but his eyes never left Garrett's face. You're making a mistake, Mitchell. A big one. That money she's got belongs to some very important people. People who don't forgive and don't forget. You hand her over now, and maybe they'll let you keep your ranch. Keep protecting her and you'll lose everything. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Before Garrett could respond, Ruby May appeared in the doorway beside him. She'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, but her stance was defiant as she faced the men who'd come to drag her back. "Hello, Buck," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "You're looking well. Prison food must agree with you." Buck's face darkened. "Cute, Ruby May, real cute. But the jokes won't save you this time. You took something that doesn't belong to you, and now it's time to pay the price." "I took what was mine by right," she replied coldly. "Every coin I earned on my back while you sat fat and happy counting your percentage. You want to call it theft? Fine, but I call it justice." "Justice," Buck spat. "You call running off in the night like some common criminal justice? You had a contract with us, Ruby May. You belonged to us. I never belonged to anyone but myself." The fury in Buck's eyes was murderous now. "We'll see about that. You got until noon tomorrow to return what's ours. After that, we start taking payment out of your pretty hide." He wheeled his horse around and gestured for his men to follow. As they rode away into the darkness, Buck called back over his shoulder, "Think real careful about this, Mitchell. Some fights ain't worth fighting." When the sound of hoofbeats had faded, Garrett lowered his rifle and turned to Ruby May. She was trembling now, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "So," he said quietly, $20,000 and a gang of killers on your trail. Anything else I should know about my prospective bride?" Ruby May's laugh was shaky but genuine. "Just that I make terrible coffee, and I can't sew a straight line to save my life. Think that's a deal-breaker?" Despite everything, the danger, the scandal, the complete upheaval of his carefully ordered life, Garrett found himself smiling. "I suppose I've heard worse marriage proposals." They stood together on the porch, looking out at the valley that stretched away into darkness. Somewhere out there, Buck Torrance and his men were making camp and planning their next move. By morning, word of the confrontation would spread throughout the territory, and Garrett's reputation as a respectable rancher would be in ruins. Yet as he glanced at the woman beside him, this notorious, complicated, and dangerous woman who'd turned his world upside down in the span of a single day, he realized he didn't care as much as he should have. "Ruby May," he said finally, "why did you really come here? And don't tell me it was just about fulfilling Catherine's obligation. You could have taken that money and disappeared anywhere. Why choose to honor a marriage contract with a stranger?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it. "Because for 2 years I read every letter Catherine sent you. I read about your dreams, your plans, your hopes for the future. And somewhere along the way I started wanting those things too. Not for Catherine, but for myself." She turned to face him, and in the lamplight he could see tears glittering on her cheeks. "I know what I am, Garrett. I know what people think when they look at me. But for just once in my life, I wanted to be someone's choice instead of someone's convenience." The honesty in her words hit him harder than any of Buck Torrance's threats ever could. This wasn't the confident, calculating woman who'd stepped off the train that morning. This was someone who'd risked everything for the chance at something better, something real. "And if I choose you?" he asked quietly. "What then?" Ruby May wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the carefully applied rouge. "Then we figure out how to stay alive long enough to find out if we can make it work." As if summoned by her words, a coyote's howl drifted across the valley, wild and lonesome and full of promises that might never be kept. Garrett looked at the woman beside him, this beautiful, dangerous, impossible woman who'd brought chaos into his ordered world, and made his decision. "All right, Ruby May Henderson," he said. Let's get married. Dawn broke grey and threatening over Clearwater Valley, with storm clouds gathering like dark omens above the distant peaks. Garrett had barely slept, spending most of the night checking the perimeter of his property and ensuring all his ranch hands were armed and alert. Buck Torrance's deadline loomed like a hangman's noose, and the morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over the ranch like a shroud. Ruby May had surprised him by being awake before sunrise, standing in the kitchen fully dressed in a simple blue traveling dress that somehow made her look younger and more vulnerable than her fancy silks ever had. She'd braided her fiery hair into a practical style and scrubbed her face clean of paint, revealing a constellation of freckles across her nose that she'd kept hidden beneath cosmetics. "You look different," Garrett observed, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. "Disappointed?" There was genuine uncertainty in her voice, as if his opinion mattered more than she cared to admit. "No. You look—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Real." A flush crept up her neck, and for a moment she was almost shy. "I figured if I'm going to be a rancher's wife, I should probably look the part. At least for the wedding." The wedding! In all the chaos of the previous evening, it had almost seemed like an abstract concept. But now, with the sun climbing higher and the church bells of Clearwater Bend beginning their morning call, the reality of what they were about to do settled over them both. "About that," Garrett said carefully, "we need to discuss the practicalities. Reverend Clark will expect certain assurances about your background." Ruby May's newly softened expression hardened slightly. "You want me to lie to the preacher about what I've been? I want you to survive long enough to become something else." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Ruby May studied his face intently, as if trying to read some hidden truth in his features. "And after we're married? What then? Do I become the perfect little wife who pretends her past never happened? Do we both spend the rest of our lives waiting for someone to expose the truth?" Before Garrett could answer, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. But these weren't the menacing hoofbeats of Buck Torrance's gang. This was a single rider moving at a steady pace. Through the kitchen window, they watched as Sheriff Morrison rode into the yard, his badge catching the early morning light. "Morning, Garrett," the sheriff called as he dismounted. "Mind if we have a word?" Garrett stepped onto the porch, Ruby May remaining discreetly in the doorway behind him. Sheriff Morrison was a fair man, honest as they came, but he was also a political creature who understood the delicate balance required to keep peace in a frontier community. "Jake, you're up early. Didn't sleep much." "Oh, truth be told." The sheriff removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through his graying hair. "Had some interesting visitors last night. Buck Torrance and his boys made camp just outside town limits. Been asking a lot of questions about you and your intended." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests they're not just passing through." Morrison's eyes flicked toward Ruby May, then back to Garrett. "Look, I've known you for 15 years. You're as honest as the day is long, and you've never given me a moment's trouble. But Torrance is connected to some dangerous people down in Silver Creek, and his presence here puts the whole town at risk." Garrett felt Ruby May tense behind him, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Sheriff Morrison, I believe I owe you an explanation." Morrison's expression was carefully neutral as she stepped onto the porch. "I'm listening, miss. My name is Ruby May Henderson, and it's true that I operated a business establishment in Silver Creek. It's also true that I left under less than ideal circumstances. But I came here legally with a valid marriage contract, and I have no intention of bringing harm to your community. That may be your intention, miss, but Torrance seems to have other ideas. He's been spreading the word that you're a thief and a runaway, and that anyone who helps you is going to answer to his employers." "And what do you think, Sheriff?" Garrett asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them with the sharp eyes of a man who'd spent years reading people's true intentions. "I think," he said finally, "that a woman's past is her own business, provided she's not breaking any laws in my jurisdiction. And I think Buck Torrance is the kind of man who gives honest outlaws a bad name. The unexpected support from the lawman seemed to surprise Ruby May more than anyone. You're not going to ask me to leave town? Ma'am, if I ran every person with a questionable past out of Clearwater Bend, I'd have to close down half the businesses and most of the church congregation. Morrison's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. Besides, Reverend Clark's been praying for someone to shake up this town's complacency for years. Might be the good Lord's got a sense of humor after all. Ruby May actually laughed at that, a genuine sound of relief and gratitude. Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know. Don't thank me yet. Torrance is planning something for this afternoon, right around the time your deadline expires. My advice? Get married quick and get gone quicker, at least until things cool down. After the sheriff left, Garrett and Ruby May made their preparations in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the day might bring. Maria Santos bustled around the kitchen, packing supplies and provisions with the efficiency of someone who'd lived through range wars and Apache raids. She might not fully understand the situation, but she recognized danger when it came calling. By mid-morning, they were ready to leave for town. Garrett had chosen his Sunday best, a black wool suit that made his shoulders look broader and his grey eyes more intense. Ruby May had added a small hat with a simple veil that partially obscured her distinctive features, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers Maria had gathered from the ranch's meadow. The ride to town was tense, with both of them scanning the horizon for any sign of Buck Torrance's men. But the countryside remained peaceful, with only the occasional hawk circling overhead to break the monotony of empty grassland. Clearwater Bend looked different in the harsh light of midday. The wooden buildings seemed smaller and more fragile, as if a strong wind might blow them all away. A handful of townspeople moved about their business, but Garrett noticed how many of them found excuses to duck into stores or cross the street when they saw his wagon approaching. The church sat at the far end of Main Street, its white-painted steeple reaching toward the grey sky like a prayer-made manifest. Reverend Clark was waiting for them on the front steps, his black coat freshly brushed and his Bible clutched in hands that trembled slightly with age. Mr. Mitchell. Miss. He paused, clearly uncertain how to address Ruby May. Henderson, she supplied calmly. Ruby May Henderson. Of course. Miss Henderson. The Reverend's voice was carefully neutral, though his eyes held the gentle compassion that had made him beloved by his congregation. Shall we proceed? The interior of the church was cool and dim, with dust motes dancing in the colored light that streamed through stained glass windows. A handful of townspeople had gathered. Doc Harrison, Mayor Fletcher, and surprisingly, Mrs. Henshaw, with several other church ladies. Their presence was clearly more about witnessing history than offering blessing, but it was something. As they stood before the altar, Garrett found himself studying Ruby May's profile in the subdued light. The simple dress and modest veil couldn't disguise her beauty, but they revealed something else, a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with her notorious reputation. When she turned to face him, her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. Reverend Clark opened his Bible and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony. But before he could get more than a few sentences in, the church doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the sacred space like thunder. Buck Torrance stood framed in the doorway, backlit by harsh sunlight, with two of his men flanking him. His expensive clothes looked rumpled from a night spent camping, and his pale face was flushed with anger and whiskey. Well, he drawled, stepping into the church with the casual arrogance of a man who feared nothing. Ain't this touching? The whole town turned out to watch a whore play dress-up. The congregation gasped as one, and Mrs. Henshaw clutched her prayer book so tightly her knuckles went white. But it was Reverend Clark who surprised everyone by stepping forward, placing himself between Buck and the altar. "This is a house of God, sir," the elderly preacher said firmly. You will show proper respect or you will leave. Buck's laugh was ugly. Respect. Old man, the only thing in this building worth respecting is the money that belongs to my employers. Hand over the woman and nobody has to get hurt. I'm afraid I can't do that, Reverend Clark replied. This young lady is about to become Mrs. Mitchell, and she's under the protection of both the law and the Lord. The law? Buck gestured toward the empty doorway. I don't see Sheriff Morrison here to protect anyone. And as for the Lord, well, he helps those who help themselves. Buck's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but he never cleared leather. Garrett had moved with the fluid speed of a man accustomed to danger, his own Colt appearing in his hand as if by magic. The click of the hammer being cocked echoed through the sudden silence. I wouldn't, Garrett said quietly. Not in a church, and not in front of ladies. For a moment the two men stared at each other across the narrow aisle, the air thick with the promise of violence. Then Buck slowly raised his hands, though his smile never wavered. Easy there, Mitchell. No need for anyone to get shot over a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding here is you thinking you can walk into my town and threaten my bride. Your bride? Buck's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. You really think you know what you're getting, don't you? Let me tell you what Ruby Mae Henderson really is. She's about to become my wife, Garrett interrupted firmly. And that's all anyone in this church needs to know about her. The simple declaration seemed to surprise everyone, including Ruby Mae herself. She looked at him with wonder, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Buck's expression darkened further. You're making a mistake, Mitchell. A fatal one? Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. For another long moment, tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Then Buck stepped back, gesturing for his men to follow. This isn't over, he said. Not by a long shot. You've got until sundown to come to your senses. After that... He shrugged eloquently and turned toward the door, but he paused on the threshold, looking back at Ruby Mae with something that might have been regret. You could have had everything, Ruby Mae. Real security, real protection. Instead, you chose to play house with a dirt farmer who doesn't know what he's getting himself into. I chose freedom, she replied simply, something you wouldn't understand. After Buck and his men left, the church fell into an uncomfortable silence. Several of the townspeople began whispering among themselves, and Garrett could see doubt creeping into their faces. The romantic notion of defending a lady's honor was one thing, but facing down professional killers was quite another. Reverend Clark cleared his throat and opened his Bible again. Shall we continue? The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Garrett heard himself reciting vows he'd never imagined speaking, felt the cool metal of a simple gold band sliding onto his finger, tasted the salt of tears on Ruby Mae's lips when they kissed to seal their union. Through it all, he was acutely aware of time slipping away, of the sun moving steadily toward the western horizon, of the deadline that would bring Buck Torrance's final ultimatum. When it was over, when Reverend Clark pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation offered polite applause and awkward congratulations. But Garrett could see the fear in their eyes, the knowledge that their quiet town was about to become a battleground. As they prepared to leave the church, Doc Harrison approached them with a small wrapped package. A wedding gift, he explained with a slight smile. Medical supplies? Something tells me you might be needing them before this is over. Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the storm clouds, casting everything in sharp relief. Clearwater Bend looked peaceful enough, but Garrett could feel eyes watching from windows and doorways, or could sense the tension that had settled over the town like a blanket. So, Ruby Mae said, as they climbed into their wagon, what now, husband? Garrett looked at his new wife, this beautiful, dangerous, complicated woman who'd changed his life irrevocably in the span of 2 days and made a decision that would determine both their futures. Now we go home and wait for Buck Torrance to make his play. And when he does, we'll be ready for him. As they rode out of town, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the general store. or the way that figure mounted a horse and rode hard toward the hills where Buck Torrance was making his plans. The game was entering its final phase, and all the pieces were moving toward an inevitable confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the future of everyone they'd come to care about. The ranch hands were waiting when Garrett and Ruby May returned home, their faces grim with the knowledge that trouble was coming. Tom Bradley, Garrett's foreman for the past 8 years, approached the wagon, with his hat in his hands and worry etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "Boss, we got problems," Tom said without preamble. "Had 3 of the boys quit this morning, said they didn't sign up to fight somebody else's war. Can't say I blame them, but it leaves us short-handed." Garrett helped Ruby May down from the wagon, noting how she held her head high despite the obvious tension among the men. "Who stayed?" "Me, Carlos, Pete, and young Jimmy, that's it. 4 men against however many Torrance brought with him." Tom's weathered face was apologetic. "The others, they got families to think about." "I understand," Garrett said, and he meant it. A man's first duty was to his family, and asking cowboys to risk their lives in a fight that wasn't theirs was more than most employers could expect. Ruby May stepped forward, surprising everyone. "Tom, isn't it? I want you and the other men to know that none of you owe me anything. This fight is about choices I made long before I ever came here. If you want to leave, I'll understand." The gruff foreman studied her for a long moment, taking in the simple dress, the honest eyes, the lack of artifice in her manner. "Ma'am, begging your pardon, but I've worked for Mr. Mitchell for 8 years. In all that time, I've never known him to make a bad decision about what was worth fighting for. If he says you're worth it, that's good enough for me." The simple declaration of loyalty seemed to steel the resolve of the remaining men. Carlos Mendez, a vaquero from the Mexican settlements, nodded his agreement. Pete Hawkins, an ex-cavalry soldier with scars from the Indian Wars, checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. Even Jimmy Walsh, barely 19 and still soft around the edges, straightened his shoulders with newfound determination. "All right then," Garrett said. "Let's get ready." The next few hours passed in tense preparation. The ranch house was positioned strategically on a small rise overlooking the valley, with good sight lines in all directions but limited cover for attackers. Garrett had his men check ammunition, position rifles at key windows, and establish fields of fire that would make any approach costly for Buck's gang. Ruby May surprised them all by producing a small derringer from her belongings, a pearl-handled lady's gun that looked decorative but, as she demonstrated with a few practice shots at tin cans, was perfectly functional in the right hands. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Garrett asked, impressed despite himself. "Silver Creek wasn't exactly a peaceful town," she replied, reloading the tiny weapon with practiced ease. "A woman in my position learned to protect herself." Oh, she didn't last long. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Maria Santos busied herself in the kitchen, cooking what she grimly referred to as perhaps the last good meal they'd all share. The smell of beef stew and fresh bread filled the house, creating an odd domesticity that contrasted sharply with the weapons being cleaned and the watch being kept at every window. It was Ruby May who first spotted the riders approaching from the east, dark shapes against the dying light of sunset. "They're coming," she called softly, and immediately the house transformed from home to fortress. Buck Torrance rode at the head of his column, but Garrett could see he'd recruited additional men since the morning. Instead of 6 riders, there were now at least 10, all armed and spreading out in a tactical formation that spoke of military experience. "Professional soldiers," Pete Hawkins observed grimly. "This ain't just hired guns. These boys know what they're doing." The riders stopped just outside rifle range and made camp with military precision, setting up a perimeter that effectively surrounded the ranch house while staying beyond accurate shooting distance. It was a siege formation, designed to wait out defenders rather than assault them directly. Buck Torrance himself rode forward alone, stopping just within shouting distance of the house. In the gathering dusk, his pale face looked almost ghostly as he called out his demands. "Mitchell, your time's up!" Send out the woman and her stolen money, and the rest of you can ride away unharmed." Garrett stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "Counter-offer, Torrance. You and your boys ride out now, and I won't put bullets in all of you." Buck's laughter echoed across the valley. Big words from a man who's outnumbered 3-1. "But I'm feeling generous tonight, so I'll give you one more chance. Send her out by full dark, or we start shooting. Then you'd better get ready to dig some graves." Garrett called back. Buck wheeled his horse around and rode back to his men, and Garrett could see them settling in for what looked like a long wait. But something about their positioning bothered him. They were too spread out, too organized, too patient. This wasn't the behavior of men planning a frontal assault. "They're not planning to attack," Ruby May said quietly, appearing beside him on the porch. "Buck's too smart for that. He knows a direct fight would cost him men, and dead gunfighters don't collect wages. Then what's he planning?" Before she could answer, a new sound reached them from the darkness, the distant lowing of cattle in distress. Garrett felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what was happening. "The herd," he breathed. "They're stampeding the cattle." The sound grew louder, a thunderous rumbling that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Through the darkness, Garrett could see his prize breeding stock, 3 years' worth of careful selection and planning, being driven in panic across the valley by riders with torches and guns. "No!" The anguish in his voice was raw and painful. Those cattle represented everything he'd worked for. His entire future reduced to scattered, terrified animals disappearing into the night. Ruby May's hand found his arm. "Garrett, I'm sorry. This is because of me." But her husband's face had gone cold as winter stone. "No, this is because Buck Torrance thinks he can destroy what other men have built and face no consequences." The night erupted in gunfire as Torrance's men began shooting from multiple directions, not trying to hit anyone, but keeping the defenders pinned down while the cattle theft continued. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies, and bullets whined off the house's wooden walls and shattered windows. "Stay low," Garrett shouted, returning fire toward the nearest muzzle flashes. The other defenders spread out through the house, each man covering a different approach route, while trying to present minimal targets. The shooting continued sporadically through the night, a deadly game of cat and mouse that served Buck's purpose perfectly. Every shot fired by the defenders used up precious ammunition, while his men could afford to waste bullets, knowing they had the superior position. It was near midnight when young Jimmy Walsh made his mistake. Spotting movement near the barn, he leaned too far out of his window to get a better shot, exposing himself to a sniper hidden in the tree line. The crack of a rifle was followed immediately by Jimmy's cry of pain as a bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. Doc Harrison's medical supplies proved their worth as Ruby May and Maria worked together to clean and bind the wound while bullets continued to fly around them. Jimmy was lucky. The shot had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels, but he was effectively out of the fight. 4 against 10 now, Tom Bradley muttered grimly as he reloaded his rifle. "And they've got us surrounded." "Maybe not," Ruby May said quietly. She'd been thinking while tending Jimmy's wound, and now she moved to where Garrett was crouched beneath a shot-out window. "And there's something you need to know about Buck. He's not just after the money, he's after me, personally." "What do you mean?" Ruby May's face was pale but determined. 3 years ago, before I started skimming money from the house accounts, Buck wanted to make me his exclusive property, buy out my contract and keep me just for himself. I refused, and he's never forgiven the insult. Garrett studied her face in the dim light. "You're thinking about surrendering. I'm thinking about ending this before more good men get hurt because of my past. Absolutely not." His voice was flat and final. "You're my wife now, Ruby May. That means we face whatever comes together." Before she could argue, Carlos called out from his position at the back of the house. "Senor Garrett, someone's coming up from the south, but they're flying a white flag." Through the darkness, a single rider approached under a makeshift truce banner. It wasn't Buck Torrance this time, but one of his lieutenants, a lean, hard-faced man who looked like he'd been born with a gun in his hand. "Mitchell," the man called. "Name's Wade Carson. Buck wants to parley." Garrett considered for a moment, then stepped out onto the porch, with his hands visible but his gun still holstered. "I'm listening." "Buck's got a new deal for you. He keeps the cattle as compensation for his trouble, and you keep the woman. All you have to do is agree never to leave this valley, and he won't come back." The offer was tempting. His herd was already gone, and this would at least guarantee Ruby May's safety. But Garrett could see the trap hidden in the words. What's to stop him from coming back anyway, once he's gotten what he wants? Carson's smile was cold as January wind. "Nothing. But you got my word he won't bother you as long as you stay put. Of course, you might find it hard to make a living without any cattle to sell. It was extortion, pure and simple. Accept Buck's terms and become a prisoner on his own land, watching his ranch slowly die from lack of income. Refuse and face a siege that could only end one way. Tell Buck I need time to consider his generous offer," Garrett said finally. Carson nodded and rode back into the darkness, leaving the defenders to contemplate their increasingly desperate situation. The night was far from over, and everyone knew that Buck's patience wouldn't last forever. As if summoned by their despair, a new sound reached them from the hills. The distant call of a war party signal, but wrong somehow, more like... Ruby May's head snapped up in recognition. "That's not Indians," she whispered. "That's Sheriff Morrison." Sure enough, the sound came again, 3 short blasts on a horn, followed by 2 long ones. The signal was answered from another direction, then another, as if the hills themselves were coming alive with hidden allies. Through the darkness, muzzle flashes began appearing behind Buck's positions, and the night erupted in a vicious crossfire as Morrison's posse, apparently larger than anyone had expected, caught the attackers in their own trap. "Hot damn!" Pete Hawkins whooped. "The cavalry's arrived!" But as the battle raged around them, Garrett realized this was only the beginning. Buck Torrance might be defeated tonight, but the larger forces behind him, the criminal empire that had sent him after Ruby May, wouldn't simply accept this loss and disappear. The real war was just beginning. The battle lasted until first light, a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouted commands that echoed across the valley like thunder. When the smoke finally cleared and the last shots faded into memory, Buck Torrance's siege had been shattered completely. Sheriff Morrison's posse, which turned out to include not just lawmen but armed citizens, from 3 neighboring counties, had caught the attackers in a devastating crossfire that left half of them dead or wounded, and the rest in full retreat. Buck himself had escaped in the confusion, along with Wade Carson and 2 other survivors, but their carefully planned operation lay in ruins around them. The professional soldiers Buck had hired were either dead, captured, or fleeing back towards Silver Creek with their tails between their legs. As dawn broke over the Clearwater Valley, Garrett and Ruby May stood on their bullet-riddled porch, surveying the aftermath of the longest night of their lives. The ranch house looked like it had been through a war, which, in many ways, it had, with shattered windows, splintered wood, and bullet holes marking every wall. Sheriff Morrison approached them with his hat in his hands, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of a man who'd ridden hard through the night and fought a pitched battle at the end of it. "Sorry we took so long getting here," he said simply. "Had to gather men from Clear Creek, Millerville, and even down to Fort Benson. Word spread pretty quickly that you folks were in trouble." Ruby May stared at him in amazement. "All those men came to help us? But they don't even know me." "Maybe not," Morrison replied with a tired smile. "But they know Garrett, and they know what's right. Buck Torrance made a mistake when he tried to bring his brand of justice to our territory. Men like that think they can intimidate honest folk, but sometimes they find out differently." Dr. Harrison emerged from the house, his medical bag in hand and blood on his shirt sleeves. "Young Jimmy will be fine. Clean wound, no permanent damage. Got 2 of Torrance's men patched up as well. They'll live to stand trial, assuming they want to testify against their former employer." The offer of testimony proved prescient. Within hours, one of the captured gunmen, a small-time outlaw named Pete Yancey, who'd been recruited for the job, was spilling everything he knew about Buck Torrance's operation. The picture that emerged was far more complex and dangerous than anyone had imagined. Buck wasn't just a saloon owner from Silver Creek. No, he was the front man for a criminal syndicate that stretched from Denver to San Francisco, dealing in everything from stolen cattle to human trafficking. The $20,000 Ruby May had taken represented just a fraction of their operation, but her theft had exposed weaknesses in their money laundering system that threatened to bring unwanted attention from federal authorities. They weren't just after the money, Yancey explained, eager to trade information for leniency. They were after her because she knew too much about how they moved dirty money through legitimate businesses. Ruby May was their bookkeeper for 2 years. She knew names, dates, amounts, everything. Ruby May listened to this revelation with growing understanding and horror. "That's why Catherine was so eager to leave Philadelphia," she murmured. "She wasn't just some church girl looking for adventure. She was running from the same people I was, in her own way." The full truth emerged slowly over the next several days as federal marshals arrived to investigate the syndicate's activities. Catherine Worthington had indeed been a respectable young woman, but her father had been one of the syndicate's business partners in Philadelphia. When he tried to expose their operations to authorities, he died in what appeared to be a carriage accident. Catherine had fled west, seeking safety in anonymity and a new life far from her father's enemies. When Ruby May had approached her with the marriage proposal swap, Catherine had seen it as the perfect opportunity to disappear completely. The piano player she'd allegedly eloped with was actually a federal agent assigned to protect her while she testified before a grand jury in San Francisco. "So neither of us was what we seemed," Ruby May said as she and Garrett sat on their repaired porch, watching the sun set over a valley finally at peace. "She was a witness hiding from killers, and I was a thief running from the same syndicate that killed her father. And I was a lonely rancher who thought he was ordering a bride like a catalog purchase," Garrett added wryly. "Seems like the universe had other plans for all of us." The syndicate's downfall came swiftly once the federal authorities had their evidence. Catherine's testimony, combined with Ruby May's intimate knowledge of their financial operations and the additional evidence seized from Buck's abandoned camp, provided prosecutors with everything they needed to roll up the entire network. Buck Torrance himself was captured 3 weeks later trying to board a ship in San Francisco, his pockets stuffed with stolen money and his plans for escape thwarted by federal agents who'd been tracking the syndicate for months. The man who'd seemed so powerful and untouchable was revealed to be nothing more than a middle management thug in a criminal organization that was already crumbling from within. With their enemies either dead, captured, or scattered to the winds, Garrett and Ruby May finally had the chance to build the life they'd both dreamed of but never dared hope for. The ranch had suffered significant damage during the siege, but insurance money and a loan from the Territorial, a bank secured by Garrett's reputation and the promise of future cattle sales, provided the capital needed for rebuilding. The stolen cattle were never fully recovered. But neighboring ranchers, grateful for Garrett's stand against outside criminal influence, offered breeding stock at generous prices. Within 6 months, the Mitchell Ranch was running more cattle than ever before, and Garrett's reputation as a man who stood by his principles had made him one of the most respected figures in the territory. Ruby May's transformation was perhaps even more remarkable. The notorious saloon girl disappeared completely, replaced by a ranch wife whose intelligence, courage, and fierce loyalty to her new community won over even the most skeptical townspeople. She threw herself into ranch life with the same determination that had once made her successful in the saloon business, learning to manage accounts, organize supplies, and even help with roundups when extra hands were needed. The church ladies, who'd initially been scandalized by her arrival, gradually came to appreciate her contributions. to community fundraising and her surprising knowledge of scripture, apparently acquired during long, lonely nights in Silver Creek when she'd read everything she could get her hands on, including several versions of the Bible. People can change, Reverend Clark observed during one of his visits to the ranch. Sometimes all they need is the chance to become who they were meant to be, instead of who circumstances forced them to become. Maria Santos, who'd stayed on as housekeeper despite the danger and chaos, became Ruby May's closest friend and confidant. The two women, separated by culture and background, but united by their experience of starting over in a harsh frontier environment, formed a bond that transcended their employer-employee relationship. "Senora Ruby May," Maria said one evening as they worked together preparing dinner, "you are not the same woman who stepped off that train." Ruby May paused in her bread-making, flour dusting her simple cotton dress and her red hair pulled back in a practical bun. "How so?" "That woman was running from her past. This woman is building her future," it was true. The desperate edge that had driven Ruby May to steal money and flee across half a continent had been replaced by a quiet confidence born of genuine security and love. She no longer painted her face or wore provocative clothing to attract attention. Instead, she discovered the power of being valued for her mind, her character, and her unwavering loyalty to the people who mattered to her. Her relationship with Garrett deepened as they faced the challenges of rebuilding together. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, born from desperate circumstances, evolved into something neither of them had experienced before. A partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and gradually genuine affection that grew stronger with each passing day. "I never thanked you," Ruby May said one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching their cattle graze in the distance. "For what?" "For seeing something in me that I didn't even know was there. For giving me the chance to become someone worth being." Garrett took her hand, noting how the calluses from ranch work had replaced the soft palms of her former profession. "You were always worth being, Ruby May. You just needed the right place to prove it." 6 months after the siege, they received word that Catherine Worthington had successfully testified before the grand jury and was entering the federal witness protection program with a new identity and a new life somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Her courage in facing down the same criminal organization that had terrorized Ruby May had helped ensure that justice was finally served. The final chapter of their story began to write itself on a crisp autumn morning when Dr. Harrison rode out to the ranch with news that would change everything once again. "Well, Mrs. Mitchell," he said with a knowing smile after completing his examination, "I'd say you and your husband have approximately 6 months to prepare for your next great adventure." Ruby May stared at him in wonder, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat belly. "Are you certain?" "As certain as medical science allows. Congratulations, my dear. The notorious Ruby May Henderson is going to be a mother." When she told Garrett the news that evening, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around the kitchen, while Maria Santos beamed with delight and began immediately planning for the arrival of their first child. As they stood together on their porch that night, looking out over the valley that had witnessed their transformation from strangers into partners, from outcasts into pillars of their community, Ruby May reflected on the strange turns that life could take. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Catherine Worthington had actually shown up that day?" she asked. Garrett considered the question seriously. "I think I would have married a perfectly nice woman and lived a perfectly ordinary life. And I would never have known what I was missing. And what were you missing?" He turned to face her, his gray eyes reflecting the starlight. "The chance to be part of something extraordinary. The chance to discover that love isn't about finding someone who fits into your existing life. It's about finding someone worth changing your entire life for." Above them, the Montana sky stretched endlessly, filled with stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of dreams. and the endless capacity of human beings to surprise themselves with their own strength and courage. The notorious Ruby Mae Henderson was gone forever, replaced by Mrs. Ruby Mae Mitchell, wife, partner, expectant mother, and living proof that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the most unexpected arrivals on the most ordinary days. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying new dreamers toward uncertain destinies. But in the warm glow of the ranch house windows, two people who'd found their way home in each other's arms prepared for the next chapter of a love story that had begun with deception and blossomed into truth. And in the growing darkness, the lights of Clearwater Bend twinkled like earthbound stars, marking a community that had learned to judge people not by where they came from, but by who they chose to become when given the chance to start over. The story was far from over. There would be children to raise, a ranch to run, and undoubtedly new challenges to face together. But for now, in this moment of hard-won peace and unexpected joy, Garrett and Ruby Mae Mitchell had everything they'd never dared dream of: a love worth fighting for, a future worth building, and the knowledge that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst possible complications. The notorious working girl and the bachelor cowboy had found their happily ever after, not in spite of their complicated beginning, but because of it. And in a world that often seemed determined to keep people trapped by their past mistakes, their story stood as proof that redemption, love and second chances were always possible for those brave enough to reach for them. 5 years had transformed the Clearwater Valley in ways no one could have predicted. When that fateful train first pulled into the station, the Mitchell Ranch had become the most prosperous operation in 3 counties, but more importantly, it had become the beating heart of a community that had learned to measure worth by character rather than reputation. Ruby Mae stood at the kitchen window of their expanded ranch house, watching her 4-year-old daughter Emma chase chickens in the yard, while their 18-month-old son Daniel toddled after her on unsteady legs. The sight never failed to fill her with wonder. These beautiful children who bore no trace of their mother's scandalous past, innocent souls who would grow up knowing only love, security, and the respect their parents had earned through years of hard work and dedication. "Mama, look," Emma called, her bright copper curls, so like her mother's, catching the morning sunlight as she pointed excitedly toward the main road. "Visitors coming." Ruby Mae smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. Emma had inherited not just her mother's striking looks, but also her sharp intelligence and fearless curiosity about the world. The child spoke 3 languages, thanks to Maria Santos's patient tutoring, could ride a horse almost before she could walk properly, and possessed an uncanny ability to read people's true intentions, a skill that had served the Mitchell family well on more than one occasion. The approaching rider turned out to be a woman traveling alone, something unusual enough to warrant attention in frontier territory. As the figure drew closer, Ruby Mae felt a familiar stirring of recognition, though it took several moments for her to place the elegant lady in the expensive traveling dress. It was Catherine Worthington, or rather, the woman who had once been Catherine Worthington. 5 years in the federal witness protection program had changed her considerably. Gone was the nervous, frightened girl who had fled Philadelphia after her father's murder. In her place sat a confident woman with steel in her spine and purpose in her bearing. Garrett emerged from the barn where he'd been working with the new foals, Tom Bradley at his side. Both men had aged well in the past 5 years, Garrett's temples showing silver now, but his frame still strong and capable, while Tom had finally married Mrs. Henshaw's widowed sister and become a pillar of the church community. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom muttered under his breath, then quickly glanced around to make sure neither Emma nor the approaching Sunday sermon regulars had heard his language. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he added to Ruby Mae. Catherine dismounted with practiced ease, revealing riding skills that hadn't been evident in her correspondence years earlier. Everything about her spoke of a woman who had not merely survived her ordeal, but had thrived in spite of it. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said formally, extending a gloved hand to Ruby May, "I hope you'll forgive the unexpected visit, but I had to see for myself how the story ended." Ruby May accepted the handshake, studying Catherine's face with interest. "The last we heard, you were safely relocated somewhere in Oregon Territory. What brings you back to Montana?" "Justice," Catherine replied simply. "The final members of the syndicate were captured last month in Chicago. The federal prosecutors tell me that my testimony, combined with the evidence gathered here 5 years ago, has finally closed the book on one of the largest criminal organizations in the Western Territories." The news was welcome, though not entirely surprising. Over the years, they'd received periodic updates from federal marshals about the ongoing investigation, watching as the syndicate's remaining leadership was systematically hunted down and brought to trial. But hearing that it was finally, completely finished, brought a sense of closure that Ruby May hadn't realized she'd been craving. "There's something else," Catherine continued, reaching into her traveling bag to withdraw a familiar leather pouch. "This belongs to you, I believe." Ruby May stared at the pouch in amazement. It was the $20,000. She'd stolen from Buck Torrance's operation, money that had been confiscated as evidence during the federal investigation, and which she'd assumed was lost. Forever, the federal government has officially returned it to you as compensation for your cooperation in the investigation, Catherine explained. "Along with this," she handed Ruby May an official-looking document bearing government seals and signatures. The document was a formal commendation from the Territory of Montana and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, recognizing Ruby May's courage in providing crucial evidence that had led to the destruction of a major criminal enterprise. More importantly, it was an official expungement of any charges that might have been filed against her for the original theft. "You're a free woman, Ruby May," Catherine said softly. "Officially, legally, and completely. The government considers your actions justified under the circumstances, and any warrants or accusations related to your past have been permanently dismissed." The weight of those words settled over Ruby May like sunshine after a long winter. For 5 years, despite the happiness she'd found and the life she'd built, there had always been a shadow in the back of her mind, the fear that someday someone would come forward with accusations about her past that could threaten everything she'd gained. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you make sure this reached me personally?" Catherine's smile was warm and genuine. "Because 5 years ago, a woman I'd never met took an enormous risk to help me disappear when I desperately needed to vanish. You could have taken Catherine Worthington's identity and disappeared yourself. But instead, you honored a promise to a stranger and married a man who turned out to be everything his letters claimed, and more." She gestured toward Garrett, who was lifting Emma onto his shoulders while Daniel clung to his leg. "You gave me the gift of freedom, Ruby May. The federal agents found me because of the trail you helped create, yes, but they also found me because I was finally ready to stop running and start fighting back. Your courage inspired mine." The revelation that Catherine had been watching from afar, following the Mitchell family's progress through government contacts and newspaper reports, was both touching and slightly overwhelming. Ruby May had never considered herself particularly brave. Her actions had been born of desperation and the need to survive rather than any noble calling. "What about you?" Ruby May asked. "What's next for the former Catherine Worthington?" "I'm Sarah McKenna now, and I've been teaching school in a little town outside Portland. But with the syndicate finally destroyed, I can stop looking over my shoulder and start living for the future instead of hiding from the past." Sarah paused thoughtfully. "Actually, I was hoping to make a proposal." Over dinner that evening, with Emma chattering excitedly about their visitor and Daniel clapping his hands at the attention, Sarah outlined her idea. The federal government, in recognition of the role that Clearwater Valley had played in dismantling the syndicate, was prepared to invest significantly in the area's development. There was talk of a new railroad spur, expanded telegraph service, and even the possibility of establishing a federal courthouse and marshal's office. "They want to build something good here," Sarah explained, "as a symbol that crime doesn't pay but courage and community do. And they want local people to lead the effort." The proposal was ambitious: establish Clearwater Valley as a model frontier community, complete with modern schools, medical facilities, and business opportunities that would attract honest, hard-working families from across the country. Sarah wanted Ruby May and Garrett to be the cornerstone of that effort, using their story as proof that anyone could build a better life through determination and mutual support. "There's one other thing," Sarah added, reaching into her bag once more. "I never congratulated you properly on your marriage." She withdrew a small, elegantly wrapped package that contained the most beautiful silver hairbrush set Ruby May had ever seen, engraved with delicate roses and inscribed with the words, "To Mrs. Mitchell, may your future be as bright as your courage." It was supposed to be a wedding gift, Sarah admitted. "I had it made in Philadelphia before everything went wrong. I've been carrying it for 5 years, hoping someday I'd have the chance to deliver it properly." That night, after Sarah had settled into the guest room and the children were asleep, Ruby May and Garrett sat on their porch, discussing the day's revelations and the opportunities that lay ahead. $20,000, Garrett mused, still somewhat stunned by the return of money they'd both assumed was gone forever. "We could expand the ranch, buy more land, maybe even start that horse breeding program you've been talking about." Ruby May nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. "Or we could do what Sarah suggested, help build something that would benefit everyone, not just us. You want to take on the federal development project." "I want to take on whatever challenge comes next," she replied firmly. 5 years ago, I came here running from my past. Now I want to help other people build their futures. The decision to accept the federal government's proposal wasn't made lightly. But once made, it transformed not just the Mitchell Ranch, but the entire character of Clearwater Valley. Within 2 years, the railroad spur was operational, bringing new settlers and business opportunities. The school that Sarah McKenna established became a model for frontier education, drawing visitors from territorial capitals who wanted to study her innovative teaching methods. Doc Harrison, now officially appointed as the Federal Territory's chief medical officer for the region, established a proper hospital with the latest medical equipment shipped in from Chicago and New York. Sheriff Morrison found himself promoted to federal marshal, overseeing law enforcement for a region that had become one of the safest and most prosperous in the entire Montana territory. The church that had witnessed Ruby May and Garrett's marriage became the center of a thriving community that welcomed newcomers regardless of their past, as long as they were committed to building something better in their future. Reverend Clark, now assisted by 2 younger ministers, presided over more baptisms, confirmations, and weddings than he'd ever imagined possible in a frontier community. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Ruby May herself. The woman who had once been known as the most notorious working girl in the territory became one of the most respected community leaders in Montana, serving on the Territorial Education Board and eventually being elected as the first female member of the county council. Her past was never hidden or denied. Indeed, it became part of her strength as a leader. When young women arrived in the territory with nowhere else to turn, they found in Ruby May someone who understood their struggles without judgment, someone who could offer practical help and genuine hope for a better future. Emma and Daniel grew up in this environment of second chances and endless possibilities, secure in the knowledge that their parents were people who had overcome tremendous obstacles through courage, love, and unwavering commitment to each other and their community. They would eventually become leaders themselves. Emma as a territorial judge and Daniel as a successful rancher and businessman. But they never forgot the lessons they'd learned watching their parents transform a scandal into a love story and a community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they stood once again on the porch where so much of their story had unfolded, Ruby May and Garrett reflected on the journey that had brought them from that first shocking morning at the train station to this moment of quiet triumph. "Do you ever miss it?" Garrett asked teasingly. "The excitement, the danger, the notoriety." Ruby May laughed, the sound rich and warm and completely different from the calculating laugh of the woman who had stepped off that train a decade earlier. "Not for a minute. I spent too many years being someone I had to be instead of someone I wanted to be. And who did you want to be?" She gestured toward the thriving community spread out below them, where electric lights now twinkled in windows and the sound of children playing echoed from a dozen different yards. "Someone who mattered," she said simply. "Someone who made a difference. Someone who proved that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be." Above them, the same Montana sky that had witnessed their first meeting stretched endlessly, filled with stars that seemed to shine brighter over Clearwater Valley than anywhere else in the territory. And in the warm glow of their home, surrounded by the sounds and sights of the community they had helped build, Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell prepared for whatever adventures the next chapter of their remarkable story might bring. The notorious Ruby May Henderson was now just a memory, replaced by a woman whose greatest notoriety came from her tireless work on behalf of others, whose greatest scandal was the depth of her love for her family and community, and whose greatest legacy would be the proof that in America, anyone willing to work for it could write their own happy ending. The story had come full circle, from a desperate woman seeking escape to a fulfilled woman offering hope to others seeking their own second chances. And in the quiet moments before sleep, Ruby May Mitchell smiled to think that sometimes the most beautiful destinations could only be reached by taking the most unexpected journeys. Years continued to pass, each one bringing fresh challenges and deeper satisfactions. Emma Mitchell graduated from Sarah McKenna's school at the top of her class, then shocked the territory by announcing her intention to study law at a university back east. Her parents' unconventional courtship had taught her that conventional expectations were meant to be questioned, not blindly followed. "I want to help women who find themselves in impossible situations," Emma declared during a family dinner when she was 17. "Women like Mama were, who needed someone to fight for their legal rights when society has written them off." Daniel, now 15 and already showing the ranching instincts that would make him legendary throughout the territory, supported his sister's ambitions completely. "Someone's got to keep changing things for the better," he said, with the quiet wisdom that reminded everyone of his father. "Might as well be us Mitchells." The children's confidence in their ability to shape the world stemmed directly from witnessing their parents' transformation of Clearwater Valley. What had begun as a small ranching community was now a thriving hub of commerce and culture, complete with its own newspaper, theater company, and even a small college that attracted students from across the Western Territories. Ruby May's involvement in territorial politics had evolved from county council member to advisor on women's issues for the territorial legislature. Her speeches about second chances and the power of community support were quoted in newspapers from San Francisco to Denver, making her one of the most recognizable advocates for progressive causes in the American West. But it was her quiet, daily work with individual women that truly defined her legacy. The Mitchell Ranch had become an unofficial sanctuary for women escaping difficult circumstances. Abused wives, abandoned mothers, young women fleeing arranged marriages or worse. Ruby May never turned anyone away, and her network of allies throughout the territory ensured that every woman who sought help found not just temporary shelter but genuine opportunities to rebuild their lives. One such woman was Isabella Rodriguez, a young Mexican-American widow who arrived at the ranch with her 3 small children after her husband's family had tried to steal her property following his death. Ruby May not only provided legal assistance through her connections, but helped Isabella establish a successful seamstress business that eventually employed a dozen women from the surrounding communities. Another was Margaret O'Brien, an Irish immigrant whose husband had abandoned her and their twin daughters in Denver, with nothing but debts and broken promises. Under Ruby May's mentorship, Margaret discovered a talent for business that led to her opening the territory's first female-owned bank, specializing in loans to women entrepreneurs. These success stories multiplied year after year, creating a network of strong, independent women throughout Montana Territory who looked to Ruby May Mitchell as both inspiration and practical guide. The woman who had once sold her body for survival had become someone who helped other women reclaim their dignity and build prosperous futures. Garrett's role in these transformations was quieter but no less important. His reputation for fairness and integrity made him the unofficial mediator for disputes throughout the region. Ranchers, farmers, merchants, and even territorial officials sought his counsel when complex problems required wisdom rather than force. The Mitchell Ranch itself had expanded to encompass nearly 50,000 acres, making it one of the largest operations in Montana Territory. But size wasn't what made it remarkable. It was Garrett's innovative approaches to land management, worker relations, and community partnership that drew visitors from agricultural colleges across the country. He'd pioneered profit-sharing arrangements with his cowboys that ensured loyalty and hard work while providing his employees with genuine opportunities to eventually own their own spreads. Tom Bradley had been the first to benefit from this program, using his savings to purchase a neighboring section and establish a successful horse breeding operation in partnership with the Maine Ranch. The integration of Mexican vaquero techniques with traditional American ranching methods had revolutionized cattle handling throughout the territory. Carlos Mendez, now the ranch's head vaquero and Garrett's closest advisor on livestock matters, had trained dozens of young cowboys in the subtle arts of reading cattle behavior and managing large herds with minimal stress to the animals. Even the ranch's approach to dealing with the changing relationship between settlers and Native American tribes reflected Garrett's commitment to finding solutions that benefited everyone involved. When territorial tensions over land rights threatened to explode into violence, it was Garrett who organized meetings between tribal leaders, ranchers, and territorial officials that resulted in mutually beneficial agreements for shared water rights and seasonal grazing arrangements. These diplomatic successes had earned him invitations to serve as territorial representative to Washington, D.C., offers he'd consistently declined in favor of remaining close to home and family. "Let other men chase political glory," he'd tell Ruby May during their evening conversations. "I'd rather build something lasting right here." The couple's influence extended beyond their immediate community through their extensive correspondence with people across the country. Ruby May's letters to women's rights advocates in New York and Washington provided first-hand accounts of how Western communities were pioneering new approaches to gender equality. Her insights were frequently quoted in national publications and congressional debates about women's suffrage and legal rights. Garrett's exchanges with agricultural innovators, territorial administrators, and even foreign visitors studying American frontier development had established him as one of the most knowledgeable voices on sustainable ranching practices and community development in the American West. There, home had become an unofficial stopping point for travelers, researchers, and dignitaries passing through Montana Territory. The guest book in their front hall contained signatures from senators, foreign diplomats, university professors, and famous writers, all drawn by the remarkable story of transformation that the Mitchell Ranch represented. But perhaps the most meaningful entries came from the women who had found refuge and renewal under the Mitchells' protection. Page after page contained thank you notes from women who had arrived broken and desperate, but left with skills, confidence, and hope for the future. One entry, from a young woman named Patricia who had fled an abusive marriage, captured the essence of what Ruby May and Garrett had built together. "I came here thinking my life was over. I leave knowing it's just beginning. Thank you for showing me that a woman's past doesn't have to define her future, and that there are still places in this world where kindness is stronger than judgment." As Emma prepared to depart for her legal studies back east, and Daniel took on increasing responsibilities for ranch operations, Ruby May and Garrett found themselves reflecting on the unexpected legacy they'd created together. What had begun as a desperate bargain between strangers had blossomed into a partnership that had touched hundreds of lives and helped reshape an entire region. Their love story had become legend throughout the territory, the tale of the notorious saloon girl and the respectable rancher who had found redemption and purpose in each other's arms. But they knew the real story was more complex and beautiful than any legend could capture. It was about two people who had refused to let their past mistakes define their future possibilities. It was about the transformative power of unconditional acceptance and the strength that comes from facing challenges together rather than alone. Most importantly, it was about the ripple effects of courage, how one person's decision to risk everything for a chance at something better can ultimately change the lives of countless others. Standing on their porch one final evening, watching the sun set over a valley filled with thriving farms, successful businesses, and happy families, Ruby May and Garrett knew they had achieved something far greater than personal happiness. They had proven that in America, anyone willing to work for it could not only change their own life, but help others change theirs as well. The notorious Ruby May Henderson had long since faded into history, replaced by a woman whose greatest notoriety came from her unwavering commitment to justice, compassion, and the radical belief that everyone deserved a second chance to become their best self. And the lonely bachelor cowboy had discovered that the greatest adventure wasn't building an empire. It was building a legacy of hope that would outlive them both. Their story would be told and retold for generations, inspiring countless others to take their own leaps of faith toward uncertain but promising futures. Because sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the most ordinary decisions to trust in love, hope, and the possibility that tomorrow can always be better than yesterday. The decade that followed brought changes none of them could have anticipated. Emma's legal career flourished beyond anyone's wildest dreams, culminating in her appointment as the youngest federal judge in territorial history at age 28. Her landmark rulings on women's property rights and domestic violence cases established legal precedents that influenced legislation across the western states for decades to come. From her courtroom in Helena, Emma often reflected on the morning she'd watched her mother step off that train, transformed from society's cast-off into one of its most respected figures. Those early memories of witnessing courage in action had shaped her understanding of justice as something that must be fought for rather than simply expected. Daniel's approach to ranching proved equally revolutionary, though in quieter ways. His implementation of rotational grazing techniques preserved grassland while increasing cattle yields, earning recognition from agricultural scientists at Eastern universities who traveled west specifically to study his methods. More importantly, his establishment of the territory's first cooperative livestock breeding program allowed smaller ranchers to compete with large operations, strengthening the entire regional economy. The partnership between the Mitchell siblings became legendary in its own right. Emma's legal expertise protected Daniel's business innovations from corporate challenges, while Daniel's financial success funded Emma's pro bono work with disadvantaged women. Their collaboration embodied the values their parents had instilled, that individual success meant nothing unless it lifted up the entire community. Back in Clearwater Valley, new stories of transformation continued to unfold daily. The town's reputation as a place of second chances had attracted an international community of immigrants, reformed criminals, war veterans struggling with their memories, and women fleeing impossible circumstances across 2 continents. Among the most remarkable arrivals was Dr. Chen Wei, a Chinese physician who had fled San Francisco after anti-Asian violence destroyed his practice and threatened his family's safety. Skeptical townspeople initially viewed his traditional healing methods with suspicion, but when Dr. Chen successfully treated a diphtheria outbreak that had baffled conventional medicine, he became one of the community's most valued residents. His integration into Clearwater society exemplified the town's evolution under Ruby May and Garrett's influence. Rather than demanding he abandon his cultural practices, the community learned to appreciate the value of diverse approaches to common problems. Dr. Chen's collaboration with Doc Harrison created a medical practice that combined Eastern and Western techniques, producing better outcomes for patients while fostering understanding between different cultural traditions. The success story repeated itself with countless other newcomers. Maria Santos's nephew, Father Miguel Guerrero, arrived from Mexico to establish the territory's first bilingual church services, helping Spanish-speaking families maintain their cultural identity while integrating into the broader community. His sermons about redemption and second chances, delivered in both languages, drew congregations from hundreds of miles away. The town's transformation attracted national attention when President Benjamin Harrison visited Montana Territory in 1891. His stop in Clearwater Valley, originally planned as a brief courtesy call, extended to 3 days as he witnessed firsthand the remarkable community development that had occurred. During a public address at the new town hall, President Harrison praised the Mitchell family specifically, saying, "In Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, we see the very best of American values, the courage to overcome adversity, the wisdom to build something lasting, and the generosity to ensure that others might benefit from their success. They represent proof that our nation's greatest strength lies not in our ability to judge one another, but in our capacity for redemption and renewal." Ruby May's response to the presidential recognition revealed the depth of her transformation. Rather than basking in the praise, she used the platform to advocate for federal legislation, protecting women's rights and establishing programs to help former prostitutes transition to legitimate employment. Her speech, later published in newspapers across the country, became a rallying cry for the women's suffrage movement. "Mr. President," she had said, "I stand before you today not as an example of what one woman can achieve, but as proof of what any woman might accomplish if given genuine opportunities rather than moral lectures. The question isn't whether women like me deserve second chances, it's whether our society is wise enough to offer them before desperate circumstances force us to create our own." The federal programs that eventually resulted from her advocacy helped thousands of women across the American West escape lives of desperation and build legitimate futures. The legislation, informally known as the Ruby May Mitchell Act, established job training centers, temporary housing assistance, and legal protection for women seeking to leave prostitution. Meanwhile, Garrett's influence on territorial development continued expanding through his work with the newly formed Montana Cattlemen's Association. His leadership during the harsh winter of 1893, when coordinated relief efforts saved thousands of head of cattle and prevented economic catastrophe for dozens of smaller ranchers, demonstrated the power of cooperation over competition. The crisis had begun when unprecedented snowfall trapped cattle across the territory, threatening mass starvation that would have bankrupted the entire regional economy. Rather than protecting only his own interests, Garrett organized a massive coordinated response that shared resources, expertise, and labor among all ranchers, regardless of their previous competitive relationships. His innovative solution involved creating temporary sheltered areas using portable structures that could be quickly assembled and moved as needed. The technique, developed in partnership with Native American tribes who had centuries of experience with harsh winters, saved not only cattle, but also strengthened relationships between white settlers and indigenous communities. The success of this collaborative approach led to the establishment of the Western Territories Mutual Aid Society, an organization that provided disaster relief, shared agricultural knowledge, and mediated disputes across state lines. Garrett served as its first president, but more importantly, he ensured that its principles of cooperation and mutual support became permanent features of Western development. These large-scale achievements were matched by countless smaller acts of kindness and transformation that defined daily life in Clearwater Valley. The town's school, now expanded to include a technical college, regularly graduated students who went on to become teachers, engineers, doctors, and business leaders throughout the western states. Many of these success stories began with students who had arrived as orphans, refugees, or children of the women Ruby May had helped. The educational opportunities that Sarah McKenna and her successors provided transformed not just individual lives, but entire family lines, breaking cycles of poverty and desperation that might otherwise have continued for generations. One particularly moving example was young Timothy Reeves, whose mother had arrived at the Mitchell Ranch pregnant and fleeing an abusive relationship. Raised by the entire community rather than any single family, Timothy grew up to become a renowned engineer whose innovations in railroad construction opened up previously inaccessible regions to development. His wedding ceremony in 1895, held in the same church where Ruby May and Garrett had been married, brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the Clearwater Valley community. The guest list read like a catalogue of American success stories: reformed criminals who had become respected businessmen, former prostitutes who had founded charitable organizations, immigrants who had built thriving enterprises, and children who had grown up to become leaders in their chosen fields. Ruby May and Garrett, now in their 50s but still vibrant and active, served as unofficial grandparents to dozens of these success stories. Their home remained a gathering place for celebrations, consultations, and quiet moments of reflection for people who credited them with making their achievements possible. The couple's own relationship had deepened and evolved in ways that continued to surprise them both. The passionate attraction that had initially drawn them together had matured into a partnership so complete that they often seemed to share thoughts and instincts. Their ability to complement each other's strengths while compensating for weaknesses had become legendary among couples throughout the territory. Their evening conversations on the ranch house porch had become an institution in itself, with neighbors and visitors often joining them for discussions that ranged from practical ranching matters to philosophical questions about the nature of justice, redemption, and human potential. These informal gatherings had influenced territorial policy, resolved community disputes, and inspired countless personal transformations. As the 19th century drew to a close, Ruby May and Garrett found themselves increasingly focused on ensuring their legacy would continue beyond their own lifetimes. They established the Clearwater Valley Foundation, an endowment that would provide perpetual funding for women's shelters, educational scholarships, and community development projects throughout the American West. The Foundation's charter explicitly stated its mission to help people write their own stories of redemption rather than remain trapped by the stories others have written about them. This philosophy, born from their own experience of transformation, became the guiding principle for humanitarian efforts across multiple states. Their influence had grown, far beyond what either had ever imagined possible when they first stood on that train platform facing an impossible situation. The notorious saloon girl and the lonely rancher had become symbols of American possibility, proof that the nation's promise of reinvention and renewal was more than just political rhetoric. Yet for all their public achievements and recognition, their most treasured moments remained private and simple: quiet evenings with their children and grandchildren, sunrise rides across land they had helped heal and develop, and the deep satisfaction of knowing they had used their second chance to create second chances for countless others. The story of Ruby Mae Henderson Mitchell and Garrett Mitchell had become more than just a tale of personal transformation. It had become a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and community to create change that ripples across generations, touching lives in ways that can never be fully measured but will never be forgotten. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.